Okay, great. So, obviously, here's our topic here, where and why value engineering goes wrong for capital projects. And the genesis of this was several years ago. I got to more or less thinking about a lot of the value engineering work that I had done over the years. And by the way, I see that Howard Elegant is one of the people in attendance. And many, many moons ago, like around 1979 or 1980, I was in a 40-hour value engineering training program up at University of Wisconsin, and Howard was one of the members of the faculty. So, kind of funny how some of these things kind of come around. And I spent a number of years in Chicago, but for the last 30 plus years, I've been out here in Nevada and primarily here in the Western states and so on. And so, with a lot of the value engineering work that I've seen and talking to a lot of the consultants, kind of some of the frustrations that bubble up in terms of what we see and mistakes that we see, and so on and so forth. And so, go to the next slide. And obviously, there's my bio. And of course, you can see that I'm a consultant, as well as being a faculty member at UNLV. And of course, my definition of a consultant, that's the person who borrows your watch and tells you what time it is, right? So anyway, so then let's go to the next slide. And this is really one of my favorite quotes. And this came out of another value engineering presentation years ago in Chicago by somebody that Howard Elegant probably knows, Tom Cook. And he liked to frame his value engineering presentations with one of these quotes. And I've always liked that quote myself, too. Next slide. And so I think what I'm going to do, because the way that I originally set this presentation up was for people that aren't necessarily tuned into value engineering. Obviously, for a group like this, I'm going to bore you to tears if I spend time talking about value engineering. So you've got the PowerPoint presentation, but why don't we, in the interest of time, kind of skip through to go to slide number 13. And we're on slide number 4 right now. And takes a second to work through this one here because of the way it comes in. And of course, you're all familiar with the concepts of function, quality, and cost, and kind of that three-legged tripod and the 6-step value engineering process. Okay, so here we go. So what this is basically kind of the sum total of experience from when I was in college. I had a couple of classes where our faculty talked about value engineering, but it wasn't really until I got out into the real world and actually started doing value engineering, and then realizing some of the problems and so on that beset some of the value engineering efforts and so on. And so then let's go to the next slide. And so obviously here, warning, danger ahead. And I don't think I'm going to offend anybody in this group. If I was making a presentation to owners or developers or architects, I might, but I think that a lot of you are familiar with some of the pitfalls and so on. So let's go to the next slide. And so, in a general sense, failure reason number one is that we don't implement value engineering on a lot of projects when we really should. And the attitude is that, well, hey, we just costed out our project during the design stage and we're making budget. And so why should we employ value engineering? What's the point? But one of the problems is that second bullet point there is just because you're making budget doesn't mean that you're actually achieving good value on the project. And then, of course, the third thing is how many times have we seen the situation where project estimates in design and the project goes out to bid and the bids come in way over what the anticipated cost was from the design process. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's a little bit late to try to be effective on value engineering. So then next slide. And the second item is a failure to understand what value engineering is. And so the term value engineering has been so misused, and it's used as a term for cost cutting or for reducing quality, reducing cost, when that's not what really value engineering is. And one of my favorites was, this is years ago, and I was working with a contractor over on an expansion phase here in Las Vegas of the Las Vegas Convention Center. And we were walking around with the architect, and it was a major architect here in Nevada. And the two individuals that were walking with us pointed over toward these escalators. And they said, we value engineered those escalators. And I went, wow, an escalator is a pretty complicated piece of mechanical equipment. And we don't in Nevada build escalators. These escalators happen to be Otis. And, they're all the way back on the East Coast. And I said, well, you value engineered the escalators. What did you do? And any of you that have been out to Las Vegas for a convention, they have meeting rooms there near the central hall up on the second floor. And the original plan was 2 escalators going up and 2 escalators going down. And so when you have these large meetings, obviously you're able to handle these big crowds. Well, what was the solution of the architect in terms of value engineering? They just eliminated 2 of the escalators. They eliminated one of the up escalators and they eliminated one of the down escalators. And that's what the architect wanted to call value engineering. And I think a lot of you have seen that. And I think that's one of the big problems out there, is that because people don't understand what it is, that's a problem that we see there. Okay, next slide. Failure a lot of times to look at total life cycle costs. And so a lot of times, unfortunately, what people want to do is that they just want to look at initial construction costs. And obviously, energy costs are trending higher and higher all the time. Labor costs for operation and maintenance are trending higher and higher all the time. And the thing is that it's a situation where if we just look at initial construction costs, I think we make a big mistake. And one of my experiences was on a prison project here in the United States, where one of the people on the team started looking at staffing levels and at configuration of the prison. And they were able to eliminate 1 guard per shift by reconfiguring how that prison was set up. And you think 1 guard per shift. What is that? Well, keep in mind that prison obviously is open 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. If you're able to save 1 guard per shift, that's a huge savings. And so that's one of the issues that we get into, is that people just want to look at construction costs and they don't want to look at these other areas. Next slide. And so there we go, for example. And this is with one of my clients who's a hospital company, meaning they operate several hospitals. They build them from scratch and then they just hold them. And so these were numbers basically that they had showing you kind of the way the pie is sliced up. And what you see there is obviously operation costs are a huge, huge number. And if you can save money on operation costs, that ends up being significant. Where your initial design construction costs are less than 20% of that whole pie. Next slide. And there's our iceberg. And of course, what does the client see? They're sitting there in the ship off to the side, and they see the design fees. They see the capital cost. They see the cost of the site. How much did it cost them to buy the dirt, bring the utilities in? But they don't see everything else below the waterline. And that's really, I think, one of the big areas that where I've seen success over the years is looking at those operating costs, maintenance costs, and energy costs. Next slide. The other thing that you run into, and talking to a lot of consultants that are frustrated on this, and I'm frustrated with this myself, is that you ask somebody about doing value engineering, or you talk to a design firm, AE firm, that type of thing, and they'll say, oh, hey, we do value engineering all the time. You know, that's just part of our overall everyday job, and so on and so forth. Well, the second bullet point is, number one, knowledge is exploding in all these fields all the time. And one of the other things that's happened is that third bullet point is that we've had so much fragmentation. And I can remember working on a shopping center project years ago. This is probably now 25 years ago. And there was a project here in Las Vegas. And the developer was talking to me about, we're going to have this meeting and we want you to be there. And he's mentioning some of the people that should be there. And he says, oh, yeah, and we've got our food court consultant coming from the East Coast. And I almost fell over laughing. I said, a food court consultant? I said, what is a food court consultant going to do? And he says, trust me, go there with an open mind, you know, and I shouldn't have been so cavalier. And this food court consultant had worked on shopping centers and other venues all over the place. And I was impressed that I listened to this food court consultant talk for about 20, 25 minutes during this meeting. And I learned more than I ever knew about food courts. And so that's one of the challenges a lot of times that we run into, is that our industry has been so fragmented. And, you know, there's subcontractors and third tier subcontractors and fourth tier subcontractors. And so nobody can know everything. And that's why I think value engineering can be such an important concept to get across of why this needs to be employed. Next slide. Failure to provide training. I think for any of you that have been around in the industry for more than maybe 10 or 15 years, is that one of the things that we've seen that I think is a sad development is a reduction of training budgets and training programs and so forth. And the attitude is from a whole host of managers is, well, what happens if I train Howard over here and I spend all this money training Howard, and Howard goes to work for Mushtaq, or Howard goes to work for Brian, or whoever the case may be. And so it is, what happens if we train them and they leave? And I think the most important counter to that is that fourth bullet point there. What happens if we don't train them and they stay? And so if you're going to have successful value engineering, I think one of the most important things you've got to do is provide training for those team members that are going to be on those value engineering teams. Next slide. Related to that are managers that don't want to send their people to training. One of my favorite cartoons is Dilbert, because having worked in some Fortune 500 organizations and doing consulting for certain Fortune 500 organizations, there's so much truth in that Dilbert comic strip. It's not even funny. And I buy the Dilbert books that are, collections of the comic strips and so on and so forth. And one of my favorites is the manager was looking to reduce headcount. And so he's in a meeting with the employees and he says, okay, who has some spare time to be on my productivity task force? And obviously what he's looking for is, who can I get rid of? And so the attitude, and this applies to all training, not just value engineering training, but you see managers that, well, I don't want to send my people to value engineering training because then it'll send the message that my people aren't busy enough. And so really what you have to do is at that last bullet point there, you really have to make the training mandatory. This isn't something where you can pick and choose. This is where we're going to do the training whether or not the managers like it or not. And obviously that impetus has to come from the top on down. Next slide. And then we get to item number 7 here. And there's also the attitude is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to go out, we're going to do value engineering training, and then automatically, like a smallpox inoculation, we'll be good to go. All we have to do is train people, and those people will do value engineering as part of their everyday duties, and we're good to go. And so people go through value engineering training. Like I said at the outset, one of the best programs I ever went through on value engineering was the basically 5-day value engineering workshop up there at University of Wisconsin that Howard was part of as one of the faculty. But there's obviously people out there that are doing 1-2 day training seminars and all that. But the problem is that even if people are trained, nobody ever wants to go and do the value engineering itself. So then go to the next slide. And so the other thing that you run into is, well, we don't have time to do a 40-hour workshop. And I'm not saying that a 40-hour workshop is magic, because I've seen more complicated projects where they've actually divided the project up into 2 or 3 phases and done value engineering on each one of those areas, looking at civil structural, looking at finishes, looking at MEP systems, that type of thing, in terms of their, their own effort and so on. But I think the worst thing is where nobody sits down and sets up a formalized value engineering study for a project. Instead, okay, go look at this project, and they have a few meetings and so on, and that's it. And instead, going back to that 6-step value engineering process that everyone here is familiar with, that's what you really need to do. Next slide. And so you're familiar, with the value engineering process. When I first ran into fast diagrams, and that was probably about a year before I attended that program that Howard did, I looked at those fast diagrams. I said, this is ridiculous. And then I got involved in them and got used to doing them. And I said, wow, this is a really powerful technique, and so forth. And so that's one of the things to go and look at. And then the next slide. And so, and of course, everybody's kind of familiar with this, with the fast diagram, with your basic functions and secondary functions. So we'll kind of skip past this, but this was from R. Kaufman's book on value management. And, I just put it in there as a source, because certainly I didn't come up with the fast diagram, but I think it's a very powerful concept. Next slide. And this is a kind of a fast casual restaurant. And this is an example on a restaurant of, obviously, the restaurant has to sell food. And if it can't sell food, there's no reason for the restaurant. But then obviously you take that primary function and you break it down to those various secondary functions. And you look at a 4,500 square foot restaurant and you go, that sounds kind of stupid. Why would you spend a value engineering study on a restaurant? How do you ever hope to recover the amount of the salaries and everything from the value engineering study? But this is a situation where this was a restaurant concept that got rolled out all over the United States. And so they were looking to build thousands of these restaurants. Same thing. Look at some of the value engineering that Walmart has done for like their neighborhood markets and so on, because they're not just looking at one neighborhood market, they're rolling this concept out all over the place. So next slide. Failure to have a diversified team. And what I mean by that is getting a diversity of professional backgrounds in there. We hear, especially here in the US, we hear diversity all the time. But in the context of value engineering, what we're talking about is a variety of backgrounds. And so, for example, I was working with another hospital group, and they were planning on doing a value engineering study. And I looked at the people that they were going to have on the team, and I saw the firms that were identified. And there was nobody who was from an MEP background, either in terms of MEP design or MEP construction. And given that 48% of your costs with a hospital are with MEP costs, that's just grade A industrial strength stupid, And I told my client, I said, you're not going to like me telling you this, but I said, where's anybody on this team that really knows anything about mechanical, electrical, piping systems, fire protection systems? And they looked at me for a second and they said, "Ah, that's a good point." Okay. Next slide. And everybody's always heard this. You have somebody that says they have 10 years experience. They really don't have 10 years of experience. They've really got 1 year of experience multiplied 10 times. And so, again, we want people that have a relatively wide background, including perhaps experience with, the projects that we're on, which I always think is helpful. Some people take the attitude, I'd rather bring in people that have never worked on that type of project because I don't want them contaminated by their prior experience. So there's a little bit of that, but I think it's good to have people that, have experience, particularly when you get into this operations maintenance issue, because these are the people that live with these projects and they see the consequence of bad decisions that were made in the design construction process. Next slide. Related to sending people to training or putting people on a VE team is managers don't want to give up quality people. And so they'll look and they'll say, well, gee, I've got Saad over here, or I've got Sajad over here, or I've got Howard over here, but wow, those are valuable employees for me. And so here's what I'm going to do. I've got Neil over here, and the only reason why Neil Opfer is hired is because his brother-in-law is, married to somebody, et cetera, et cetera. And so guess who goes to the value engineering study? Probably one of the people that's not going to be a real contributor. And so that's one of the things too, is that you want good people as part of these value engineering teams. Next slide. Failure to have an experienced value engineering facilitator. You're going to spend a lot of money on people's salaries in this value engineering effort. And you want somebody that has been through a lot of value engineering studies and experience as a facilitator. Is that cheap? No. Good facilitators demand a good compensation package. But this is, I think, one of the most important things, because you've got this, if this is going to be a 40-hour, 5-day effort, you've got this limited time frame. And you've got to be in a situation where that facilitator will keep people on track. Next slide. There we go. Okay. I was just about to fire my person doing the slide advances and delegate it off to somebody else, but he redeemed himself. Okay. So get an offsite location for your value engineering. And again, it's more expensive than doing it in a company conference room. But my experience is that offsite location is great. It cuts down on interruptions and so on. Obviously, cater in breaks, cater in lunch, dinner a lot of times, because as everybody knows, sometimes you're working in the evenings and so on. And you want to maximize people's time. And I think the way that you maximize people's time is kind of getting them away from all the distractions at the office. So next slide. One of the things that I'd like to do sometimes with my students at UNLV is I would like to take away their cell phones and take away their laptops so that they couldn't be texting friends, they couldn't be talking on the phone, and so on and so forth. Obviously, we can't do that. But one of the things that we want to do is we want to have people concentrated on that value engineering study. And so people shouldn't be on their cell phones, shouldn't be answering emails. They can do that during a break. They can do that at lunch, that type of thing. But this always used to be a problem because, phones have been around forever. But that little computer that I've got in my hand, that's a phone, and so on and so forth, is really, really problematic. And it bogs down the effectiveness of these value engineering studies if you don't ride herd on something like that. Next slide. Failure to start the value engineering effort early on in the design process. That second bullet point is, I hear this all the time, is that the bids come in over budget, or the estimate at the end is way higher than the owner's budget is. And so now we've got to go and we've got to do value engineering. And the value engineering that you see done is just sometimes grade A industrial stuff stupid. My favorite is, well, we had a 4-story office building and it went over budget. So now what do? Let's make it a 3-story building, or we had offices that were going to be 150 square foot, 10 by 15. Let's make them 10 by 11, and that third bullet point is your designers have a pride of authorship, and they spent a lot of time working on these plans, going from schematic design to design development through to working drawings and construction documents. And now you're going to go back and you're going to make them change those things. There's a real digging in of heels, a real resistance, because you're making the design people look bad. Whereas if you would have, way back in schematic design, been able to do some of this stuff, that would have been very successful. Next slide. And so there we go. Obviously, with the green arrows is really where we want to be doing most of our value engineering, and not be up there in the bid award construction phase doing value engineering. So then next slide. And you're all familiar with this curve. This first came out of GSA, General Service Administration, federal government here in the U.S. That's the first place I ever saw it. It's been picked up. I've seen this in various value engineering papers. Obviously been picked up here in the U.S. by CII, the Construction Industry Institute, and so on. And obviously what it shows is that, and owners need to understand this, all of you understand it, but you need to get through to the owners and developers that that's where they're able to make the biggest impact, not down the line there. Next slide. And this kind of gets back to why we want a facilitator. You've got 40 hours and you don't want to get buried in the weeds on a value engineering study. And so not looking at the most important things. And I've always liked the concept of Pareto's law of optimality. And Pareto's law of optimality was one of my degrees as an undergrad, was an economics degree. And they talked about this. And Vilfredo Pareto was an economist over in Italy in the 16th century, and he studied income distribution. And what he found was that about 20% of the people held 80% of the wealth in Italy. And then he went to other countries, and he saw no matter where he went, he saw the same trends. Well, in value engineering, it says that 80% of the cost of the project is going to be influenced by 20% of the items. It's like one of my clients that I work with is a residential merchant builder. And we do a lot of slab on grade homes here in southern Nevada because we're out in the desert. And what we have is the two highest cost areas in that residential single family home are going to be number one, the framing package, and number two, the concrete package. And so if you really want to make an impact, that's what you've got to do is look at those high cost areas. Next slide. And of course, there we see kind of a rough illustration of that 80-20 rule. So then next slide. Failure to have value engineering information available. One of my perfect examples of that, although it's happened a bunch of times, is we were doing a value engineering study on about a $200 million section of the Clark County flood control project, which at the time had about $1 billion overall budget. That's budget since then has grown quite a bit. But this is 200 million back in the early 90s. And we were supposed to have all of this cost estimating information on an estimate that had been done before we actually started the value engineering study. And here we are, Friday, I don't do anything, and this was before the internet. This is 92, 93. Don't get anything.
Neil, excuse me. I think somebody's microphone is on. Can you please mute yourself? I think one or two people have their microphones on. Go ahead. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Neil.
No problem. Typical meetings in the age of GoTo and Zoom and WebEx and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so we start the value engineering study on Monday morning. We didn't get the cost estimating information that had been promised to us until Wednesday afternoon. And, you know, we're in a 40-hour value engineering workshop, so a lot of work had to be done to kind of reinvent the wheel, you know, to come up with costs and so on. And that was really, really frustrating. And I've seen that a number of times over the years, and it just drives me up the wall. Next slide. Unrealistic owner expectations. Obviously, I'm talking to a Canadian audience, so I apologize for the square foot. I probably should have restated this as square meters and so on. But an owner wants a building at a certain quality level, and yet they want you to bring it in for about a third what the actual cost is. And value engineering can save a lot of money on jobs. And I've been on a number of jobs where we save millions of dollars. But value engineering, in my experience, is you're typically going to save in the 5-10% range. And but owners think that, you know, they can get a $500,000 house for $250,000. And that typically just is not going to work. Next slide. Lack of incentives if you actually implement some of these VE study results. And what I mean by the lack of incentives is really from the design side. Because if you're making your designer go back now and redesign things, the designers really dig in their heels. We talked about the pride of authorship aspect, but here's a designer who might be working on a 8%, 10% fee, and they've already spent all the money. And it's a, $10 million project, and they've already spent 800,000, which was their 8% fee on the project. They don't want to go back and redesign. And so if you want redesign done, from my perspective, you've got to pay for it. Obviously, it's going to reduce the overall impact of the savings, but you need to fairly compensate the designers and so on, because designers don't want to do free redesign. Go back to the or go to the next slide. With value engineering change proposal clauses, one of the things that we run into is that because the response is so slow on other aspects of the project, getting answers to RFIs and so on. A project that I was involved in Chicago was another hospital project. And at the time, it was about a $120 million project. And I was working for the HVAC contractor. Well, we as the HVAC contractor were subcontracted out to a mechanical piping contractor that was self-performing the piping, but had subbed us the mechanical. They were a subcontractor of the general. There was a construction manager, there was an owner, and then of course there was the design side with all the consultants down the food chain. And we would see opportunities for value engineering. And there was a value engineering change proposal clause in the contract. But the problem is that it was taking us 9 weeks to get answers back to simple questions. And so our attitude was, why should we spend money on value engineering if by the time we get a response back, we're already going to be past that part of the project and so on. And so a lot of the value engineering ideas that we had just never got submitted and so on. And so that's a problem. And obviously, if there's an 80-20 shared savings clause and so on, where the owner gets 80%, the contractor gets 20, the owner never gets the advantage of money that they could have saved on the project. And then go to the next slide. And so that's an example there on that hospital project where we were down there over on the right-hand side as a third-tier sub. And yet by the time we got an answer back from one of the sub-consultants, like I say, going through that whole food chain on the design side, on the construction side, it was taking us 9 weeks to get answers to simple questions. Go to the next slide. And then failure reason number 20 is fraud with value engineering change proposal clauses. So let's say that you've got an 80-20 shared savings clause in a contract. Contractor comes up with a value engineering change and says the savings are going to be $1 million. And the owner is like, wow, this is great. This is fantastic. $1 million savings. I'm going to get 800,000. Happy to pay the contractor 200,000. And what do you end up with? Well, if that real number was 1.25 million, the contractor is not only going to get 200,000, they're going to pocket another $250,000. And so one of the things that's got to be done on these value engineering change proposals is doing fair cost estimates. And this is an extreme case, but I've seen this thing happen. And I had a contractor's project manager a couple years later brag to me that this is exactly what they did on a project, and they were able to get it by the owner. And so I think that's really, really sad and not where we want to be. So then next slide. So, in summary, and go to the next slide, is that if we do things right, uh, value engineering is a fantastic tool. And, it's not a silver bullet. I can't give you that $500,000 house for $250,000 maybe, but I can save you a lot of money, or I can look at areas where you're going to have better value and you're going to save money over the course of the life of that project with labor costs, operation maintenance costs, energy costs, and so on. But the problem that we run into in the construction industry too much, in my experience, is that the value engineering efforts are either really slipshod or they're done too late in the process to achieve the benefits that if we would have done them much earlier, back in schematic design, for example, we would have been able to give the owner developer a lot better value on the project. And then the next slide. And so there we go. To our Value Voices audience, hope you've found at least a couple of things here of use. And certainly in the time available, open this up for any questions.